Welcome to Close Listening. I'm Zach Morgenstern, joined as always by silent co-host Ludwig von Bee. Today we're talking about Neil Young's On the Beach. So this is the first Neil Young record that I ever heard. And specifically, the first Neil Young song I ever consciously remember hearing was the terrifying third track of the album. It's called Revolution Blues. It was the first time I heard Neil Young's voice, which is this unusual countertenor range. He sings in this voice that is high, but not sort of smooth and falsetto. It's kind of menacing. We got 25 rifles just to keep the population down. So I've lived most of my life in Canada. And one of the most annoying things about the Canadian school system is the teachers won't shut up about things being Canadian. You know, Canada is obsessed with proving that it's not America, you know, as if remaining loyal to the British Empire was a good thing. Like we're taught to heroize this woman, Laura Secord, who betrayed the Americans during the War of 1812. Kind of weird to me anyway. But I guess my family was a refuge from this kind of dumb, everything is better Canada, patriotism. So it actually caught me off guard when I'm about 11 years old. I'm sitting in my dad's car and he puts on a CD and I asked what it was and he said, oh, it's Leonard Cohen. He's kind of like the Canadian Bob Dylan. And then a couple days later, he put on this other CD. It was also by someone who he described as Canadian. And this time it was Neil Young's On the Beach with that terrifying Revolution Blues. And it seemed like an important historical track. He said Neil Young had all these great musicians on it. The drums were really striking to me on the track. And he said, oh, that's Levon Helm from the band. So, you know, growing up in Canada, being force-fed mediocre children's books just because they were Canadian really turned me off to Canadian identity. But I have to say, as a fan of singer-songwriter music, that moment at age 11 and gradually ever since, I've come to realize that there is at least one field where Canada has had an outsized influence, and that's in producing these great singer-songwriters. So Leonard Cohen, Neil Young, Gordon Lightfoot, Buffy Sainte-Marie, Joni Mitchell, the Guess Who, the bands, you know, these aren't acts that you just hear about because they're Canadian, No, they're actually great folk bands, and the fun trivia about them is that they all come from this country with a relatively small population. So that's just one of the first things I have to say to get out of the way when talking about my personal relationship to On the Beach. That said, this is an interesting album for the more general public. So while I was doing research for this video, I realized there was some significance to my dad playing On the Beach in the car around 2004. So apparently after his Harvest album, which is from 1972, he puts out what is called the Ditch Trilogy. And I was researching this. I was like, wait a minute, I was trying to do these Neil Young albums in order. Did I skip one? Because apparently On the Beach is the second album in the Ditch Trilogy. At first I thought, oh, I ignored the album that came before it called Time Fades Away because it was a live album. I missed the fact that it was a live album of all original material. So it does count as part of the canon. But then I read a little further and saw that Time Fades Away is pretty much out of print. Like it's not something you can just get a copy of. So as a casual fan trying to go through the Neil Young canon, it was okay that I skipped from Harvest to On the Beach because I don't think I was stumbling across Time Fades Away anytime soon. That said, apparently it didn't used to be just Time Fades Away that was hard to get your hands on. Apparently, Neil Young allowed On the Beach to go out of print. You know, for years it was not available in CD or I assume cassette format, and they stopped printing new records of it. It wasn't until 2003 when they finally went ahead with re-releasing the material after a petition was put out demanding it. So why might Neil Young have not been so proud of On the Beach? Well, according to Ian MacDonald, On the Beach is kind of like John Lennon's Plastic Ono Band album in that it's Young coming forward with unabashed introspection at the expense of more glossy commercial production. I can sort of see where Ian MacDonald is coming from with that analogy, but it's nowhere near as dramatic as with John Lennon's Plastic Ono Band. With Plastic Ono Band, I have really mixed feelings about that album because it has cool stuff on it, but lots of the time it doesn't feel like you're listening to songs. It just feels like rough sketches about John Lennon's new ideas. It doesn't have the beauty, the catchiness of Beatles stuff or some of the later John Lennon solo stuff. Neil Young, by contrast, he has a pretty solid folk, blues, bit of pop rock sound on this album. And it starts wonderfully with the opening track of Walk On. It's infectious rock and roll. Then you get See the Sky Above the Rain, and it just has this wonderfully mixed soft organ with sensitive singing. And then you get to that song that really affected me as an 11-year-old kid, Revolution Blues. It has this intense rock sound, though the lyrics themselves are quite idiosyncratic. There's a line about shooting someone's dog because you were annoyed with its barking. Then you get For the Turnstiles. This is a banjo and slide guitar blues tune, and I like the focus on those real country instruments, because oftentimes when I hear a blues song, I'm like, okay, this trope has been done a million times before, playing the same chords with the exact same melody. But by mixing that country rootsy instrumentation with the blues pattern, Young got a pretty cool song. That said, track number 5 is called Vampire Blues, and it is just a standard electric guitar blues song with references to being a vampire. You would then get what would happen if you flip the record. You have a song called On the Beach, and On the Beach is a very slow jam. It kind of has a bluesy structure, but because of the twang of it and how slow it is, it gives off more of a jazz effect. One of its lyrical runs goes, I need a crowd of people, but I can't face them today. Though my problems are meaningless, that don't make them go away. So that long song, the title track, On the Beach, if you put it together with Walk On and Revolution Blues, what you start to see is On the Beach is a concept album about the LA celebrity life. You might think On the Beach sounds like too fun a title for a Neil Young record. You think of the Beach Boys, you think of parties, you think of surfing, but I guess the thing is, if you live in certain parts of the world, like in coastal Los Angeles, the beach probably loses some of its excitement. It just becomes one of those places where you go for walks. And so I feel what it signifies here, and you see on the cover, you have sort of Neil Young broodingly looking away, like the man in the famous Caspar David Friedrich painting, Wanderer Above the Sea Fog, sort of dramatic, scenic tribute to loneliness and melancholy. And then if you look at what the particular songs are about, they explore celebrity. Revolution Blues is inspired by the Manson cult. It, talks about wanting to shoot down Hollywood stars. Walk On references the kind of petty feuds and culture wars that happen once you're someone with any sort of opinion and you get in the news. There was this sort of pretend fight between Neil Young and Lynyrd Skynyrd that spoke to a sort of more real fight in Neil Young's attempt to criticize Southern racism in some of his songs. And then finally, On the Beach, the slow, I would say too slow and laid back song that apparently was composed while Neil Young was eating honey infused with marijuana. It talks about being unable to explain your isolation and depression because you have everything, you're this public figure, you have an audience, and yet somehow that's not good enough. Anyway, the final 2 tracks on the album are Motion Pictures and Ambulance Blues. Motion Pictures is another slow track, and I would in fact say the final 3 tracks on the album, so On the Beach, Motion Pictures, and Ambulance Blues, they kind of blend together for me, unfortunately. I don't like them as much as the opening of the album. Motion Pictures, what stood out to me about it sonically is Neil Young's voice kind of sounds like Willie Nelson on it. Supposedly, it sort of mourns the end of Neil Young's relationship with the actress Carrie Snodgrass. And this was an actress he developed a crush on while watching one of her movies on TV. That's the title, Motion Pictures. That said, the only reason one could infer this is a breakup song, and in fact, it doesn't mention Snodgrass. I think that's just taken for granted. Someone must have figured that out at some point, but anyway, if this is a breakup song, you can only infer that from the fact this song is from 1975 when Neil Young broke up with Carrie Snodgrass, because what it sounds like it's saying is, I don't need to be a star. I don't need to be in motion pictures. I have a motion picture star loving me in real life, and that's all I need. And I guess the sort of melancholy subtext is Neil Young was saying, well, I had that, but now I don't have it anymore. And then finally, Ambulance Blues is the track that sums up Neil Young's life and career so far. It's like a series of references. There's a reference to a riverboat, which might refer to his song Cripple Creek Ferry. There are references to issues with the critics, as referenced earlier on this album, and Walk On. and rain, as referenced in See the Sky About to Rain. The references to traveling around North America, which was a key part of his persona on his first album. And then there's, some just straight up autobiographical stuff, including a reference to a street in Toronto called Isabella Street, where Neil Young had an apartment for a while. And that's certainly a street I passed a lot at certain points in my life. And it's nothing special, but it's one I have fond memories of too. It feels like Neil Young likes to end his albums with his long Bob Dylan-y songs. He did that with his first solo album, Neil Young, as well as with Harvest. I don't really like these songs. I feel like if you're going to do these sort of long things, better to have a kind of quirky voice like Bob Dylan's rather than a sort of more melancholy, laid-back voice like Neil Young's. So On the Beach, not my favorite album per se. I don't really like the second half, and hopefully that was the reason why Neil Young wasn't in love with it. But the first three tracks, wow, Walk On, See the Sky About to Rain, and Revolution Blues. Those are three tracks. You'll hear them and you won't forget. And again, this is an album where you can't judge it by its cover. This is not surf rock. This is the most melancholy beach imaginable. And I would be very interested to hear your thoughts on it. I'm Zach Morgenstern. This is Ludwig von B. See you next time.